Quiet Strength, Chapter 3. I wanted to be a Spartan. My dad may have been a Wolverine when he was an undergrad, but after my parents finished earning their graduate degrees in East Lansing, I returned to Jackson as a huge Michigan State fan. Both as a sophomore and as a junior, I started quarterback on the Parkside High School varsity football team, and I had very good seasons both years. As a team, we were fairly good, although when I was in 10th grade, we lost our last game of the year to Jackson High School, my mom's school. We remedied that loss by beating them my junior year. Although basketball was my favorite sport, and I hadn't given much thought to playing football in college, it wasn't out of the question. And if I ever did play in college, I knew it would be for Duffy Daughtry at Michigan State. But then, following our win against Jackson at the end of my junior season, I quit the high school football team. I was 17 years old and pretty sure I knew more than my high school football coach, and I was prepared to take a stand. Quitting wasn't a devastating blow for me. After all, basketball was my primary sport, and we were having a great season. Besides, sometimes making a statement means personal sacrifice, and I was prepared to make mine by quitting the football team. Today I have a tremendous relationship with Dave Driscoll, my high school football coach, but it wasn't always that way. And if it weren't for an assistant principal who took an interest in me, I'm sure my life would have unfolded quite differently. Leroy Lockamore was an African-American administrator at our predominantly white junior high school. Although he took a personal interest in all the kids, he seemed to pay special attention to the African-American boys. He wanted to make sure that we grew up as people, not just as athletes. He often took us to basketball games and to movies, or sometimes he simply had lunch with us. Many times he brought us into his office to talk about things other than school. In short, he cared. For 2 years at Frost Junior High School, I got to know Mr. Lockramore as more than just an administrator. He was a friend, and when I moved up to Parkside High, he continued to keep tabs on my friends and me. One of my closest buddies was Bobby Burton, a receiver. The two of us had been starters on the varsity team since our sophomore season, and were the leading offensive players on the team. We had just finished the football season of our junior year at Parkside, and it had been a pretty good year, all in all. Coach Driscoll's policy was for the team to vote for the following year's captains at the end of the season. The winners would be announced at the fall sports banquet in November. That year, I was elected as team captain. Bobby wasn't. I just couldn't understand this. It seemed obvious to me that both of us should have been the captains. I could only think of one explanation. For some reason, the school didn't want 2 black captains. It seems impossible now, but at the time it didn't. Parkside's football team had never had 2 black captains, and no one could convince me that those votes had been counted correctly. I was hurt and felt certain that a race-based injustice had been done. Reacting to the hurt I felt for Bobby, as well as for myself and for all of the black players, I quit the team. I told Coach Driscoll that I was just going to play basketball my senior year. Basketball was my favorite sport anyway. So this is interesting. He plays basketball and he plays football. He's the quarterback on the football team, and he's elected captain of the football team for his senior year. And this happens, several months before the next season begins. However, his friend Bobby Burton is not elected captain, and he thinks this might be due to race, and so he ends up quitting the football team. So without talking to anyone, without confirming his suspicions, he just quits, which is an interesting thing to do. And would you do the same thing? Or would you investigate further? Or would you just stay silent? Of course, I was a fairly good player, a popular student, a newly elected captain, and the quarterback. So the other African-American players decided they were going to quit the football team too. I hadn't really thought about that possibility when I decided I wasn't going to play. But it didn't bother me at the time. I figured everybody had to make his own decision. My dad, of course, said I had to do what I thought was best. But, as he always did, he wanted to know what I was going to do to improve the situation. He wanted to know what I could do to make things better, rather than just reacting. But I was 17, and I didn't care if the situation got better or not. My feelings were hurt, Bobby's feelings were hurt, and I was so focused on playing basketball in college that I didn't think I would miss football in the least. The player walkout began after the postseason banquet in November and continued throughout the rest of the school year. At the end of the summer, when the team was preparing to go back to practice, Mr. Rockamore invited me to his house. He had already talked to me a couple of times about my decision to quit football, but I think he wanted to give me one more chance to reconsider. "Tony, you've enjoyed playing football, and these other guys enjoy playing football. You should have your senior year to play, and so should they. At the end of the day, what are you really upset about anyway?" I began to answer, but he continued, talking over me without waiting for a response. I hadn't realized his question was rhetorical. Even if the issues are that important, should they spoil the fun that all of you should be having playing football as seniors? 30 years from now, you don't want to look back and say that you missed out on something you really loved doing. Then he asked the question he really wanted me to answer. Why would you let anything stop you from doing what you have the ability to do? That's a great question. Although by then I was convinced he was right, I had always had quite a temper, and my pride just wouldn't allow me to back down. Practically speaking, I could understand Mr. Rockamore's point, but from a moral standpoint, I was still pretty sure I was in the right. Plus, at 17, and even at 51, pride and hurt feelings can be pretty overwhelming emotions. Mr. Rockamore knew I would have trouble asking Coach Driscoll if I could return, so he said he would talk with him and do his best to smooth everything over. I'll tell him you want to play and make everything all right. Don't worry about it. After he spoke with Coach Driscoll, Mr. Rockamore arranged for the three of us to meet. Coach was a very principled guy, and he set the tone for the meeting. Tony, you can come back, but you've missed winter conditioning, and you've missed our summer workouts. So you guys, he knew if I came back, the others would also come back, are going to have to do some extra stuff to earn your way back. He mentioned extra running, washing the dishes at camp, and so forth as his requirements. If I'm going to let you back. When he had finished, I think the only thing that I heard was, if I'm going to let you back. I was getting mad, thinking, if he's going to let me back? I started to get visibly upset, and Mr. Rockamore gave me a look. It was the same look I would later give John Lynch during a press conference before the 1999 NFC Championship game in St. Louis that kept me quiet and in my seat. But all the while, even Mr. Rockamore was thinking, now why did Coach have to go there? After the meeting, he took me aside and said, Coach is the coach, and you're the player, and there are times in life when you're going to have to do certain things. That's just how it goes. That's a lesson you're going to have to learn to get through life. In the end, we all went back and worked our way back onto the team. It was a great year. We only lost one game, the de facto state championship game. They didn't have playoffs in those days. Even more important, today I have a great relationship with Coach Driscoll. In fact, he came to the Super Bowl to see me, and we shared an emotional hug at our Saturday practice before the game. I see now what I couldn't see as a strong-willed teenager, thanks to the firm hand of Coach Driscoll and the gentle guidance of Mr. Rockamore. If Mr. Rockamore hadn't taken that interest in me, not merely as an athlete and a student, but as a friend, everything would have been different for me. When my friends and I left him and went to high school, he didn't stop caring about us. If he had, I wouldn't have played football my senior year, and many doors never would have opened for me later in life. He took a step he didn't have to take, and I listened to him based largely on the relationship he had worked to develop with me. I use this principle all the time now that I'm coaching. That experience also taught me about the downside of making quick decisions. To this day, I'm very deliberate, probably too deliberate at times, when I can afford to take the time to sort through a decision-making process. So we learned a couple of things about Tony here. We learned that Rockamore had a huge impact on him, right? That he didn't give up on him, that he invested time into Tony and his friends, and as a result, Tony went back to football, which changed the whole trajectory of his life. And he says in this last paragraph, the second thing is that the experience also taught him about the downside of making quick decisions, right? When we're rash, if we're quick to make a decision without thinking things through, what can be the consequences of that? Something got in the way of my vision of playing football for Duffy Daughtry at Michigan State. He retired. But his retirement opened up a number of possibilities in my mind. I considered playing basketball at Duke or Arizona, where my friend Bob Elliott was headed. I also thought about the University of Southern California for football. I'd gotten to know a number of players on different recruiting trips, including Gary Jeter, a high school All-American from Ohio. Wayne Fontes, who was then a USC assistant coach as well as their national recruiter, invited me, along with Gary Jeter and Marvin Powell, another football future star, to spend a weekend at Southern Cal. Although I couldn't make the trip to USC, the visit really impressed the other guys, who called me during the week. "Tony, you gotta come here," Gary said. "You won't believe it. They're gonna put us in the movies, in Hollywood. They took us over to Sunset Strip. This place is really something." The pitch worked for them. They ended up at USC, but didn't have time for the movies, since Gary and Marvin kept busy with football in college and then went on to play in the NFL for 13 and 11 years, respectively. Meanwhile, another coach had warned me about Southern Cal. "You'll never play quarterback," he said. "Their quarterback lived with the coach. You can't possibly beat him out." I initially chalked this up to negative recruiting, but sure enough, when I did some research, I found that Pat Hayden, USC's sophomore quarterback, had lived with head coach John McKay's family while he was in high school. I scratched USC off my list. Cal Stoll, the second-year head coach of the University of Minnesota, actually presented the most intriguing opportunity for me. Cal had coached the wide receivers at Michigan State under Coach Daughtry, and I saw joining his program at Minnesota as the closest thing to playing at Michigan State. Plus, two coaches I really liked, Woody Windenhofer and Tom Moore, were doggedly recruiting me to Minnesota. Minneapolis was closer to Jackson than Southern Cal, but not too close, and the city seemed to be home to a large number of Fortune 500 companies. Although I wasn't sure what line of work I would end up in, I figured that an education, plus summers spent working for some of those companies, would yield lifelong dividends. At Minnesota, I could play both basketball and football, which wasn't possible at most of the other schools I was looking at. Playing more than one sport was a fairly new thing at the time, although Quinn Buckner had done it at Indiana University during my senior year of high school. He had been named the Chicago High School Player of the Year in both football and basketball, and he continued in both sports at IU. I thought I would like to play both as well, and Minnesota was one of the few schools that was open to the idea of their quarterback also playing basketball. Woody Weidenhofer was the best recruiter I've ever seen. He attended almost every one of my basketball games my senior year, and we became lifelong friends. But shortly after I signed with Minnesota, Coach Weidenhofer resigned and joined the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tom Moore stayed at Minnesota as the quarterback's coach, and it was from him that I learned the same offense we run together in Indianapolis today. It was a perfect fit for me and my skills because it allowed me to call much of the game and think while I was out on the field. So he looks at all these different schools and he decides on Minnesota because they are open to the idea of him playing both basketball and football. And although football is what he ends up doing with his life, don't forget his favorite sport to play was basketball. Coach Cal Stoll at Minnesota was one of the first CEO-type coaches. Most of the coaches I'd seen previously, such as Coach Driscoll, coached either the offense or the defense in addition to performing the duties of a head coach. Coach Stoll did not. He wasn't one of those tower-type coaches like Bear Bryant at Alabama, who was far removed from the field. Coach Stoll, like Coach Daughtry had done at Michigan State, hired great teachers as his assistants and then gave them the latitude to coach. He set the vision and direction, motivated the team, and then let the assistant coaches do the coaching. Okay, and how often is that how it's structured nowadays? Coach Stoll held a meeting with the freshmen every year. During the course of our meeting, he asked, "Every one of you thinks you're going to play in the NFL, right?" Every head in the room nodded. He pulled out a photograph of the freshman team from 5 years prior. The guys who made it to the NFL were circled. Him and him, he said, pointing to the picture. 2 of them made it. Out of the 32, 33, 35, whatever we got this year, 1 of you will go on to play in the NFL. Or if you're lucky, 2. You're going to have to outwork everybody in this room and then catch a break in order to make your living in the NFL. Of course, we each thought we were going to be that one, but I must admit this did make an impression. Coach Stoll went on to talk about our education and preparing for the rest of our lives without football. Since I was just days removed from my parents' house, that message resonated with me. He continued, "Success is uncommon, and not to be enjoyed by the common man. I'm looking for uncommon people, because we want to be successful, not average." Listening to Coach Stoll, I knew I had a greater chance of becoming uncommon by my efforts than I did by my natural gifts. Some players are uncommon because of their God-given natural abilities, like being blessed with the height of Yao Ming or the vertical jump of Michael Jordan. Others have to work to become uncommon. Steve Kerr of the Chicago Bulls shot 500 free throws a day to make himself uncommon. The truth is that most people have a better chance to be uncommon by effort than by natural gifts. Anyone could give that effort in his or her chosen endeavor, but the typical person doesn't, choosing to do only enough to get by. That lesson was still fresh in my mind a few weeks later when we took the field in Columbus for Minnesota's season opener against Ohio State. As we warmed up, Coach Stoll assured us that we could win, even though we were heavy underdogs. After a few minutes, the Ohio State players emerged to a big roar from the crowd. I turned to Larry Powell, a highly touted freshman running back, and proclaimed, "Powell, we can get these guys. Look at them. They're not as big as I thought they'd be." 5 minutes later, Ohio State's offensive and defensive linemen came out of the tunnel to join the rest of the team. and I realized those initial 50 guys were only their skill position players. Larry turned to me and spoke slowly, drawing out every word. "Tony, I don't know how we're going to do it today." The halftime score was 35-7, and on the way to a final of 56-7, Ohio State. Coach Stoll calmly confessed after the game that he didn't have a speech for that situation. So much for my spectacular introduction to college football. I did get in the game for a few plays towards the end, but most people who were watching an Ohio State sophomore running back who started making history that day. Archie Griffin began his 31-game streak with at least 100 yards rushing in each game. Incidentally, his last game in that streak also came against us in 1975, my junior year. I got hurt late in my sophomore year of football, and that caused me to give up basketball after only one season. It was actually a good decision. The demands of playing both sports at a high level while keeping up academically were really more than I could handle. Although most of my college football memories are positive, some of the clearest include close losses in games that we had a chance to win. Later games against Ohio State and Michigan immediately come to mind. In addition, it was during these years that I realized I needed to make some decisions about my own personal values. Like most underclassmen, I wanted to fit in. Many of the guys I played football with went out for a few beers at night or went to campus parties, which always included drugs and alcohol. Throughout high school, I had never known anyone that is, who was an athlete or serious about taking care of his body, who drank, smoked, or took drugs. No one I respected, anyway. That changed at the University of Minnesota. There, guys who were performing at very high levels athletically also drank, smoked, and used various illegal drugs. Some coaches from other sports knew about it and even encouraged players to take their recruits to area bars. At that point, I was forced to rethink my stance on drinking and drugs and make a decision that wasn't necessarily performance-based. Up until then, my primary reason for not drinking and doing drugs was that it would hurt my performance. My dad's slides of those cigarette-smoking lab rats had never left my mind. Once the decision moved to a moral ground, however, I still came out at the same place. What would my mom and dad think? Always went through my mind whenever I had the opportunity to take a drink or smoke a cigarette. I had been taught that smoking and drinking were not right for us as a family, and illegal drugs, well, they were illegal. Therefore, they were not for me. But this was a test because I saw that great athletes could drink and do drugs and get away with it. For a while. I still hung out with all the guys and went to parties, but I never did smoke, drink, or take any drugs. And the more I was around those things, the more I understood why my decision was a smart one. So he plays college football. He does play college basketball for one season at Minnesota, but he ends up getting hurt his sophomore year during football, and so he gives up basketball and just focuses on football. Overall, his college experience is going well, but he does get introduced to the party scene there a lot, and he realizes, okay, these guys, or some of these guys who are great athletes, they do party a lot, and they're still high performers, at least presently. But if you think about that lifestyle, and if you think about famous singers or famous athletes who go down that path, that doesn't always turn out great for them. And so Tony makes the decision that he doesn't want any part of that lifestyle. Wisconsin is a big rival for Minnesota. Even today, Big Ten alums in our Colts locker room laugh about the rivalry games in the conference. It seems that each week the teams are playing for something. The Old Oaken Bucket, Purdue, Indiana. The Little Brown Jug, Minnesota, Michigan. The Islebuck, Illinois, Ohio State. The Governor's Victory Bell, Minnesota, Penn State. The Heartland Trophy, Iowa, Wisconsin. The Paul Bunyan Governor's Trophy, Michigan, Michigan State. Or a bronze pig called the Floyd of Rosedale, Minnesota, Iowa. If somebody's not handing something over after a game, it just doesn't seem like a Big Ten game. The Minnesota-Wisconsin game is the longest-running rivalry game dating back to 1890. The winner gets Paul Bunyan's axe. My junior year, we were playing Wisconsin at home in Minnesota. The weather all week had been awful, with heavy snow in the middle of the week. I told my folks not to bother trying to make the trip, but by Saturday the weather was perfect, with clear blue skies and a bracing Minnesota cold of late November. It was around 30 degrees, and the snow had been cleared off the field, was piled 4 feet high along the benches. Wisconsin had trounced us the year before in Madison, and we had some guys from Madison on our team who badly wanted to win. In addition, this was our last game of the year, and we wanted to send our seniors out with a victory. It was an emotional game for us. As we got into the game, we found we could run at will against them. From the opening kickoff, we could just feel we were going to win. On the opening drive, we took the ball and gashed their defense all the way down the field with our running game. but I knew I only needed one touchdown pass to set the Big Ten record. So on first down and goal from their 7-yard line, I changed the play at the line of scrimmage from a run to a pass. As I was releasing the ball, my arm got hit and my pass was intercepted in the end zone. When I came off the field, our offensive line coach, Roger French, was there to meet me. "I am so mad," he shouted at me. "If I had a gun, I would shoot you right now." I was glad he was unarmed. Coach French later went to Brigham Young University and coordinated some explosive passing offenses. But that day, understandably, he wanted to run the ball. Thankfully, our running back stayed hot and the offensive line controlled the line of scrimmage, and we dominated Wisconsin with the run, winning 24-3. I even threw that touchdown pass to set the record, and we were happy to have Wisconsin hand over Paul Bunyan's axe. When I arrived in Minneapolis in the summer of 1973, I was eager to start learning the no-huddle offense from Coach Tom Moore as soon as possible. I also wanted to familiarize myself with the campus and begin a summer job. The school lined me up with a position at a meatpacking plant called Feinberg's. It was within walking distance from where I was living, about 15 blocks, which was ideal because I didn't have a car. My shift started at 6 a.m., which gave me time in the afternoon to work out and spend time learning the offense with Tom. There were two minor difficulties with the meatpacking job. First, I had never worked so hard in my life, before or since. Second, I always seemed to have stray dogs following me from work to the university's football offices. I didn't feel like I was in danger of being attacked, but it took me about 3 days to figure out what was attracting them: the smell of pastrami. I stuck with that job all summer, remembering what my dad had taught me about learning from every experience. I definitely learned one thing: I never wanted to work in a meatpacking plant again. It made me value my football scholarship and free college education much more. After that summer, I found jobs on my own without the university's assistance. No more meatpacking. The summer after my freshman year, I had a great job working for Cargill on a research farm in Elk River, just north of Minneapolis. I would pick up 3 inner-city high school boys and drive them to the farm, where we helped with some of the research projects. Despite the early schedule, we had to be there at 7 a.m., meaning we left around 6 a.m. I really enjoyed it. The farm tested different types of animal feeds. We would measure the amount of food that was given and what was left over, in the troughs, thankfully, and weigh the animals periodically, among other tasks. We all found it fascinating. I got to know the high school boys through our conversations on the way to the farm, since we were usually too tired to talk on the way back. It was one of the first times I really understood that not everyone had a dad at home. In my 3rd year, I hit the jackpot, landing one of those office jobs I'd always heard about, an internship with General Mills. Our team was introducing a new cereal, Golden Grams, into the national market by testing it in 3 or 4 cities and creating an advertising campaign. It was like being on The Apprentice, without the worry of getting fired. I finally feel like I was putting my business courses to good use, but I also realized that neckties and I were not compatible. I still get a headache if I wear a tie for more than 15 minutes. By my senior year, my reputation as a football player was building, and the jobs were a little easier to find. I was much better at avoiding early mornings, farm animals, meat rending machines, and ties. That summer, I worked in the sporting goods department of Dayton Hudson's flagship department store in downtown Minneapolis. Right before the season started, the Minneapolis Tribune ran a preseason Big Ten section with a story about me, along with my photo. With my huge afro and suit, I looked as if I had just walked off the stage from the Sly and the Family Stone gig. The caption asked, "Would you buy a tennis racket from this man?" Probably a fair question. Here, Tony talks about all the different summer jobs that he had, and through these jobs, he realized what he did and did not want to do with his life, which if you've ever had a job before, an internship before, you know that's exactly what it's all about. You learn what you like, what you don't like, what you do want to do with your life, what you don't want to do with your life. Do you want to sit at a desk? Do you want to stand all the time? Do you want to interact with people? Do you not want to interact with people? And that's the whole point of having these jobs and internships. And so he takes full advantage of his summers and of these jobs to really figure out what he wants out of life, or rather, what he doesn't want out of life. In the end, I carved out a pretty nice football career under Coach Stoll and Moore at Minnesota. I graduated as a 4th all-time in total offense in the Big Ten, 2-time team most valuable player, and a captain my senior year. I was also a 2-time academic All-Big Ten, all the while having a blast running our innovative offense. We played Illinois my senior year, and they executed very sophisticated schemes on defense, requiring me to make adjustments during the game. If you see this alignment, we're getting into this formation. and so forth, as Tom Moore had instructed me. We won the game 29-14, and afterward their head coach, Bob Blackman, congratulated me for the work I had done orchestrating our offense. That meant a lot to me coming from him, because the intricacies of their defense were specifically designated to confuse the quarterback. As a result of my on-field performance in college, there was no doubt in my mind that I would be drafted and go on to a career as a quarterback in the NFL. I had worked out for scouts and coaches from a number of teams, including the Washington Redskins, who said they would be looking for a third quarterback and that I fit the bill. Some friends thought I might go to the Vikings since my style was so similar to that of Fran Tarkenton, their quarterback at the time. I shared a fairly small apartment in Minneapolis with my teammate, wide receiver Mike Jones. Mike was from Detroit Central High School and was terrifically talented. Terrell Owens reminds me of Mike, a tall, sleek, fast guy who can run, catch, and jump. Mike had hurt his Achilles tendon our junior year and was never quite the same after the injury, but he was hoping to be drafted as well. Back then, the NFL draft wasn't televised over the weekend. That year, 1977, the draft was held on a Tuesday and Wednesday, and it lasted 12 rounds. 3 of the guys Wayne Fontes had recruited to USC 4 years earlier turned out to be as good as advertised. Ricky Bell went to the Buccaneers as the first pick overall, Marvin Powell went 4th to the New York Jets, and Gary Jeter went 5th to the New York Giants. My only goal was to go somewhere in the remaining 330 picks. Mike and I waited by the phone all day Tuesday, then started our vigil again Wednesday morning. The phone finally rang Wednesday afternoon. The Giants were on the line in the 10th round and wanted to speak with Mike. So Mike was the 255th pick, following our defensive back, George Adzik, who had gone to Seattle in the 9th round. I hope Coach Stoll hadn't been right when he said only 2 guys would go to the NFL. We celebrated Mike's selection for a while and then turned our attention back to the phone to wait for my call. The phone didn't ring again. And while I didn't know it at the time, it wouldn't be the last time I waited by the phone for a call that never came. That evening around 8 o'clock, we called a buddy who was with the Associated Press. "Is the draft over?" I asked. "Yeah, it's over," he confirmed. We hung up. Nobody's called me. That doesn't seem like a good sign. It wasn't. The phone did ring a short while later, though, as NFL clubs tried to fill out their rosters, much as they do today. Starting toward the end of the draft, clubs begin to get an idea of the positions they still need to fill for training camp. If they're not able to draft enough players at a position to fill out their roster, the scouts begin working the phones, trying to find the highest-rated non-drafted players who might agree to come to camp as free agents. I had a number of opportunities during the course of those telephone calls to play defensive back or wide receiver, but I didn't receive a single offer to play quarterback in the NFL. I was crushed. So here Tony's feeling pretty good, going through his 4 years at Minnesota. He's having these different jobs, figuring out what he likes, what he doesn't like. He has a pretty good resume as a quarterback, so he's thinking, okay, I have a pretty good chance to be drafted by the NFL. But he's not. Just as his coach predicted, right, 2 other guys from the team get drafted, but he does not. He does get calls to come to camps as a free agent, but they're not in the position of quarterback. And so he experiences like this devastation to his dream at the end of chapter 3.